First of all, props to the Tattered cover. What a fantastic bookstore. I have not been here before. I've heard about it for a long time. When my publishers at Syracuse University Press said I was in California for the rollout of the book yesterday and the day before, when I was setting the trip up, they said, well, there might be space available at the Tattered cover. And I said, well, that would be fantastic. I've heard about it for a long time, but would the book sell there? And they said, well, there's no harm in trying. And so I said, well, I'm up for that. So here I am. I'd like to tell you a little bit about what this book is about. And in doing so, tell you a little bit about who Roy Kepler was. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how the book came about. This is my second book. I'm a professional journalist in the Washington Bureau of McClatchy newspapers. I've been writing stories a long time, and yet this book in particular riveted home for me like nothing else has before, some lessons about how facts come into place and how contingent a work of history is. Because I don't know about you, but when I pick up a hardcover book, a gorgeously produced book like this, it seems set in black and white as if this is the only story that could ever have been told. This is the life and times of pacifist bookseller Roy Kepler. In fact, one thing I discovered vividly is a life and times. This book is a contingency. It could have turned out any number of ways. Roy Kepler is the subject of the book. It is the life and times. This book uses Roy Kepler's life as a window into fascinating episodes of 20th century American history. Roy was a Colorado man, born and bred. He was born in Denver, went to North Denver High School, graduated from North Denver High School. He was drafted, or would have been drafted, except that he had declared himself a conscientious objector, as did his older brother Earl. The Denver Draft Board didn't believe that someone who didn't go to church could have religious or spiritual scruples against war. They denied his older brother's request, sent him off to prison. Earl was in prison for 9 months, later to join his brother for a fatefully short period. Roy was luckier. He was granted by his Denver Draft Board conscientious objector status and went off. After the war, he returned to Colorado, graduated from Colorado University, where in 1950 to 1952 he was a leader in the movement not only against nuclear war, but against conscription and against the Red Scare that was sweeping the university system. At the time, Colorado University was run by a craven individual named Robert Stearns, who capitulated to the American Legion and others who wanted to chase all the Reds out of academia. And so President Stearns hired two former FBI agents who prepared a witch list of people to be fired, dangerous characters like a square dance instructor, a philosophy instructor, an historian, and others. Roy Kepler eventually moved on past Colorado. His parents lived here for a time. So this is a hometown man of whom I write. This is the story of the civilian public service camps of World War II. Roy was one of 12,000 conscientious objectors who were accepted as having the proper reasons for opposing war. They were sent to a succession of camps throughout the country of different types. Some were high-minded, virtuous, and hardworking. Roy, for instance, worked at what was crudely called the Laurel Center for the Feeble-Minded. Conscientious objectors worked in medical experiments, they worked on farms, they worked in mental hospitals, they did exemplary work. They also went to camps that were lunatic asylums for the inmates that degenerated into sheer anarchy and chaos, that had no principle beyond thumbing their nose and doing nothing to satisfy the overseers of the camp. And Roy served in those camps as well. So this book is the story of the great hopes that underlay the civilian public service ideal and how it collapsed into impotence and rage. This book is the story of listener-sponsored public radio. After Roy graduated from Colorado, he went to California and with fellow civilian public service veterans, fellow pacifists, he started the first listener-sponsored radio station in the United States, KPFA, the foundation of what's now Pacifica Radio. The idea was revolutionary that these pacifists had. Radio is not to be schmaltzy, it's not to be layered with commercials and hype and BS. We will have, they said to themselves, radio that speaks directly, intelligently, entertainingly, but rationally about the issues of the day. We'll have music, we'll have full board discussion of what really matters. We'll talk to people as adults, not as people to be targeted for the purchase of commodities. And Roy was at the center of that until palace intrigue did him in. This is the story of the paperback revolution. Roy Kepler began his bookstore in Menlo Park, California in 1955. 1 year earlier, the poet and Navy veteran Lawrence Ferlinghetti began City Lights, the famous City Lights bookstore in San Francisco. 1 year after Kepler's began, Pat and Fred Cody began Cody's bookstore in Berkeley. Cody's, City Lights, and Kepler's were the triumvirate in the San Francisco Bay Area, the three most remarkable independent bookstores on the West Coast, and to some degree the spiritual forefathers of great stores like the Tattered page here. This is the story of the anti-war movement in the 1960s. Roy was an early opponent of the Vietnam War before it was even known as the Vietnam War. At the time that the Green Beret advisors were first going into South Vietnam, Roy was already trying to rally opposition to it. He was instigator of some of the most important rallies, in particular in 1967 at the Oakland Draft Center. He was a spiritual and organizational leader, and through his experiences, this book opens a window into the anti-draft movements of the 1960s. This book is the story of the Silicon Valley. The people who began the personal computer revolution got their start at Kepler's also. Steve Wozniak, the co-founder of Apple Computer, grew up as a teenager, the son of a Lockheed Missiles and Space engineer. He told me that when his dad wanted a textbook or a scientific text, he would go to Kepler's. Steve Wozniak would follow along. Steve would remember getting some of the basic fundamental electrical engineering texts that laid the foundation for his own later work and research. Larry Tesler, later to become the chief scientist at Apple Computer, got his start at Kepler's, standing at the counter listening to Roy and his associate, a man named Ira Sandpearl, talk about peace and justice, and on the side he would buy the computer books and the math books that laid the technical foundation for his later work at Apple. Some of the most important developments in the computer revolution, particularly in the 1970s, occurred within a range of several miles of Kepler's. It was ground zero. There's a very fine book by John Markoff called What the Dormouse Said, and it's about the relationship between the counterculture of the 1960s and the personal computer and the internet revolution in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And tellingly, Markoff puts at the center of what he was reporting on Kepler's books. Kepler's was at the center, both as a place where people could buy their scientific manuals, but where they could find their inspiration as well. So that when the Homebrew Computing Club started to experiment with the very first homemade personal computer, the Altair, they got the magazines at Kepler's, they circulated their newsletters at Kepler's, they organized the first meetings where they began to swap ideas. This book is the story of the remarkable individuals that Roy Kepler knew and influenced. People like Linus Pauling, the Nobel Prize winner in both peace and chemistry. Back in the day when Dr. Pauling was still at Caltech, Roy Kepler recruited him for the movement to argue the case for peace. On one occasion, Roy recruited Dr. Pauling to debate Edward Teller, the so-called father of the hydrogen bomb. That was to Pauline's regret. Teller cleaned the floor with him. It was no comparison. Pauline never forgot the fact that he was out-debated. But nonetheless, this was one of the things that Roy Kepler did. He was constantly recruiting people to the movement. So he would recruit or attempt to Albert Einstein. It's the story of people like Joan Baez. Joan was a high school student in Palo Alto. Her father was a physicist and a Quaker who was recruited by Roy Kepler to work on a disarmament movement in the late 1950s. Joan, and there has never been a more beautiful young woman than Joan, fell under the sway of Roy, and in particular, Roy's close ally, Ira Sandpearl, a fellow pacifist, a charming raconteur, a great teacher, a world-class flirt, and a man who had a remarkable influence on Joan Baez's early years. When Joan wanted to start a peace school, she chose Ira and Roy to be her mentors. When Joan wanted to protest the Vietnam War by refusing to pay a percentage of her taxes, it was Roy who guided her. When Joan wanted to have somebody manage her money, it was Roy she chose. And then when she decided she wanted to spend more money than he wanted to allot her, it was Roy she fired. So this is the story of the individuals that Roy was involved with. As I said at the start, it is the story of all of that and more, but it is also a story. It is a contingent story. And this is the thing that David Milstead,
Hey there.
fellow journalist, still a journalist, yes?
Still a journalist, believe it or not.
Fellow Oberlin graduate and one of the finest Facebookers I know, with constant wit and insight. So this book is a contingency as well. It is contingent upon things like chance and persistence and instinct and bias. It's contingent on chance. I researched this initially by going up to Swarthmore College. I work in Washington, D.C. I would take the train to Swarthmore and then take the subway or the commuter train out to the Swarthmore station, walk across the campus, and arrive at the library and go down into the basement where the Peace Collection is held. And there I would sign a research sheet, and they would trundle out on wheels the 8 or 9 cardboard boxes of Roy Kepler's papers. And they got to know me and they knew what to expect. And one day I showed up and there was the cardboard box by the table, and I sat down and I pulled out a file and I began taking notes, and it was an interesting pacifist correspondence. And it was only after about 15 minutes that I discovered that it was the work of not Roy Kepler, but a man named Roy Finch, a pacifist, turned out a friend of Roy's, turned out a fellow co-founder of the listener-sponsored radio station. But either they had brought out the wrong box or I had picked it up by mistake from somebody else's research pile. And nonetheless, that chance encounter, I didn't know about Roy Finch at that time, that chance encounter led me to details that I was not aware of with regard to their relationship and with regard to KPFA itself. Chance played a big role in the development of this book. Persistence is an obvious part of any book. This book had its initial beginnings in 2005, but it really can be traced to 1980 when I was a reporter at the Palo Alto Weekly and began writing stories about the characters that hung around on the fringes, what remained of the counterculture of the Bay Area. And at one point in 1984, I drove to where Roy lived in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Friend took a tape recorder. She recorded, I took notes. I interviewed Roy, then in the early stages of Parkinson's disease, for 2 or 3 hours. That was 1984. In 2005, when I began this book, I discovered that I had those notes and I had the tape recording. It was just sitting, and I wasn't holding on to it deliberately. It was just sitting there. I fancied it as it was waiting for me because I knew I was going to write this book all along. It was latent persistence that blossomed in time. One thing I've discovered is there's a certain amount of delusion and necessary self-delusion and arrogance in writing a book. It's maybe like what women say about childbirth. You forget the pain, otherwise you'd never go through it again. In this case, there's a delusion that there's a book to be written, that there's an audience for it, and there's the arrogance that I'm the guy, and I have that arrogance. It's like, I was born to write this book. Why else did I hold on to the Kepler's material as long as I did? So persistence plays a crucial role, but you always hear the story about persistence, and it's always, you got to keep plugging away, and I held on to my dreams, and they turned me down, and they turned me down, and I finally prevailed. And unfortunately, that doesn't always work out that way. With Joan Baez, since I was on a mission from God, in my view, I was made to write this book. I figured Joan would finally see the light and give up 2 or 3 hours of her times, because there was much I had to ask her. I wrote her, I emailed her, I stalked her. I have a general belief as a reporter that if I meander, I'll end up right where I need to be. I'll just sort of meander, and what do you know? David Milstead showed up. That's just the person I need for my story. That's just a fundamental belief I have as a reporter. And I thought, with so much righteousness in my cause, Joan would feel that, and we would sort of come together, and it would be magical. And she didn't. She finally talked to me by phone for about half an hour, and she was completely charming and friendly and helpful. For whatever reason, I just couldn't get her to commit. Partly, I think she's tired of looking back, and partly there's some painful episodes that this book entails. The great love she had for Iris Ann Pearl, and the great fissure of their divorce. They were not lovers, or rather they were lovers in everything but the physical sense. I think mostly she just didn't want to rehash the past. So there was a case where I was as persistent as a cuss, and it got me nowhere, nothing. And I thought it would get me not only the Joan Baez material, it would get me the great story in the end. Well, she turned me down 38 times, but then the 39th time, she finally sat down for an interview, and soon we were laughing like old pals, and it did not work out that way. Bias plays a huge role in the coming together of a book like this. And I mean by that several things. I happen to love Robert Stone. He's a writer, American author, author of Dog Soldiers, and of what I just personally think is the best American novel in the last century. It's called Outer Bridge Reach, and if you haven't read it, you've got to read it. It's a great, great book. He was a Wallace Stegner Writing Fellow at Stanford in the early 1960s, and with Ken Kesey, or in or about the time of Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters, and Robert Stone was very much an early Merry Prankster type character. I happen to be interested in that era as history. I love Robert Stone, and as a writer, I figured he was bound to have spent time at Kepler's. It just went without saying. So I thought, well, I'll track down Robert Stone, and he and I, we can get together, we could get loaded together, and he could talk about being a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and winning the Pulitzer Prize, and I could tell him about winning the Robin Goldstein Regional Reporting Award. We'd bond, writer and reporter, and would have just a great time. And a fellow friend of ours, Ed McClanahan, a Kentucky writer, one of these characters of whom it was said has great potential and it was never fulfilled, gave me his number in Key West, and I called Stone up out of the blue and introduced myself. And he really wasn't in a mood to talk. I may have caught him at the bad time, but he had one thing. He said, well, Kepler's was a great bookstore, and it was a great place to pick up chicks. So I said, well, that certainly sounds real, and it certainly sheds some light. So that made its way into the portrait of the book. And it's all because I'm in love with Robert Stone as a writer, and because I admire the life that he's led, and I'm fascinated by it. And that's what drove that particular splash of paint in my portrait. In the same vein, I was profiling the Poet Laureate of the United States in my day job. In 2010, Philip Levine, the poet, was from Fresno. He used to teach at Fresno State University, so he was a local guy. I write for the Fresno Bee, among other papers. So I'm profiling him, and as I'm researching his past, I learned that he was a poetry fellow at Stanford in 1957. So after I interviewed him for my story, and he was a really great guy, really down-to-earth, wonderful character, I said, by the way, just putting on another hat here, did you used to go to Kepler's, or do you remember Kepler's? And, oh yeah, Kepler's, what a great story, and he shared some stories about it. That was random bias. And so Philip Levine's portrait of Kepler's is in this book, not because he's the most important author ever to have gone there, but I happened to have been talking to him for another reason. And it fit into my general research methodology. I have two general research methodologies for this book. In general, it's like I'm like the drunkard looking for the car keys underneath this street lamp. The policeman comes up and says, is this where you lost the keys? And the drunkard says no, but it's where the light's the strongest. And in my case, I go to where the research materials are the most voluminous and the information is the most accessible. And in that case, the best parts of this book are where the research materials were most voluminous. The light was the strongest. The civilian public service camps. I think this is a great portrait, in all arrogance, of the civilian public service camps. I haven't read a better one. And that's because the stories were just lying there waiting to be harvested in the letters, reports, documents, internal memoranda that are available in the archives. The street light was really strong there. Is that the most important part of Kepler's story? I'm not sure. The family life is sort of in shadow here. The street light didn't shine very, very bright there. The other part of my methodology is I go to where there's material and highlight it. And the other part is, my theory is Kepler's was the best bookstore on the West Coast, and everybody who likes books would go there. So I could ask anybody of note if they had gone to Kepler's and what their memories were, and I'd always strike gold. And so I cast a wide net. So the book is the life and times of a pacifist, of an organization founder, a man who led the War Resisters League, who helped found listener-sponsored radio, who helped found multiple peace groups, who helped advise activists like Randy Keeler, who went on to lead the nuclear freeze movement, and others, who helped inspire and guide people like Joan Baez. It is the story of the Silicon Valley rise and its relationship to the counterculture. It is the story of the paperback revolution, but it is a story. And somebody else, if a great reporter, or even just an average reporter were to come back and write their version, it would be slightly different. I'd like to give you a flavor for sort of how the book conveys. I'm going to read a very short excerpt. It's a little compressed, but it gives a little bit of sense of the tone of things. The war came home, as wars always will. October 1968. Violence was manifest, sheet lightning across the skies. 500,000 American troops were enmeshed in South Vietnam. Constant tumult shut Berkeley's Telegraph Avenue. Space cases and speed freaks haunted the streets around Kepler's books and magazines. Rhetoric ran hot and heavy, though Roy tried to dampen the fuse. That October, Kepler's front window display facing El Camino Real featured an iconic poster of Mao Zedong. The display was not an endorsement, though some thought it might be. Roy was, in fact, as vocally opposed to the oppressions of Chinese communism as to the war policies of the U.S. government. But when Kepler's workers arrived the morning of October 16th, they discovered a broken front window, a hatchet, and a note. First Chairman Mao, the note said, then Kepler. Several hours later, the mess cleaned up and the store opened for business. 3 men entered and took note of the broken window. They seemed to shake their head at the way of things. It was a shame such violence should occur. There was something about the men, though. They seemed pent up, ready to strike. The 3 men wondered why the store featured a poster of a Chinese communist, but not of George Wallace, a good American hero. Didn't make sense. Then the three men, having said their piece, left some unsaid message remaining behind them like a booby trap. Roy had always excited opposition. He craved it even as the sign that competing ideas were truly met. And he knew that sometimes promoting peaceful ideals could provoke violent opposition. But by 1968, Roy feared the left, by its own acting out, had drawn upon itself a commensurately violent response. Everyone was angry at everyone else. Roy could see it all around him. The thrown hatchet fit a pattern. The night of September 2nd, 1968, the nearby Free University store had been broken into. The vandals trashed equipment and files and painted the words, "Communist swine," on the walls. The night of November 13th, a brick was tossed through a window at Kepler's. 11 o'clock at night on November 24th, a pipe bomb blew out a 4-foot hole in a window at the store. Shards of glass stuck in books on the other side of the store. "I suppose," Roy said, "someone is mad at me for not being violent." Nor was Kepler's the only target. On December 1st, a small bomb tossed through the back window of a house near downtown Palo Alto blew out windows and knocked a door off its hinges. The house was used by several peace groups. The next night, a pipe bomb careened through the windows of the Free University office on El Camino. The blast shattered the windows and artwork. The police seemed powerless. Perhaps, some thought, they were in on the game. Roy took steps on his own. He and his wife, Patricia, moved their children out of the bedroom in their Los Altos home that had windows facing the street. Roy hired a private detective to nose around. He went to the FBI, the very agency that had been harassing and intimidating and spying on his peace groups for years. Quietly, Menlo Park police concocted their own audacious plan, but the attacks kept coming. At 4 a.m. on the morning of January 26, 1969, a bomb blew a hole in the front door of a Palo Alto City Councilman Kirk Comstock's house. Later that day, the councilman picked up the phone. "How'd you like the little package last night?" the voice asked. "You keep it up, you'll get more of the same." Several days later, a cherry bomb set off among the bookshelves rattled customers at the store, and less than 24 hours later, a pipe bomb fizzled out near the store where 20 people were nearby. It was the closest call yet, and there was more to come. On the night of February 14th, 1969, about 9 p.m., Los Altos Police Chief Roland Renshaw knocked on the door of Roy's Los Altos house. Renshaw had been chief of the small Los Altos Police Department for 25 years. He had never had an experience like this. Inside Roy's house, he had some news to convey, something unheard of in Los Altos. There were rumors, the police chief told Roy and Patricia, that their names were on a list. It was, the chief said, an assassination list. Maybe it was all just talk, or maybe it was the truth, and it was time for Roy Kepler and his family to hide for their lives, to flee from the war that had found them. So that is taken from a chapter about the counterattacks that took violent form and how they were resolved in very controversial and in some ways questionable ways by the police authorities. But that gives a flavor for how I write. I'm a newspaper guy, so I rather than an academic, and so I try to write with verve and immediacy, and some episodes give themselves over to that more than others. So that gives you a basic grasp of the subject. It's a case of a book that uses one man's life, an ordinary man in many respects, perhaps an ordinary man in every meaningful respect, but he happened, by virtue of his principles and his energy and by sheer luck, to coincide with some remarkable episodes. And this book uses his life to open the window on those episodes of people who opposed even the good war, of people who wanted a new way to communicate by radio, of people who wanted to find new ways to sell books and ideas, of people who recognized that the next revolution was going to be with the computer. So that's the book, and I'm glad to answer any questions about either the subject or the process of research. Yeah.
What was the most surprising thing that you discovered in writing this?
Boy, I tell you, I don't know if it was the most surprising thing, but a big surprise in the San Francisco Bay Area, this counter-revolution of 1968, 1969, when right-wing activists threw a succession of bombs and hatchets and cherry bombs and slingshots through Kepler's. Kepler's had 2 stores, both were attacked, as well as the Free University, which Kepler had helped started. And that, for those people of a certain era, they remember it, and they remember it as the work of Nazis. And there's a reason why they believe that to have been the case, because that's how it was portrayed at the time. The photographs in the local papers when the police finally made the arrest showed a Nazi flag and a lot of weaponry. They were charged with syndicalism. They were charged with being essentially political conspirators. And they were never found guilty of anything except conspiring to disrupt a meeting at a Unitarian church about Red China. But in the public memory and in my notion when I began the research, there was a group of Nazis that went out, as if they were shouting Sieg Heil, where they threw pipe bombs through the windows. And it wasn't that at all. There was a combination of mixed up kids and a couple of zealots and some adventurers out for sort of, good times, and who had the full weight of the state brought against them. So that was a real shock to me, because I had thought this was going to be Nazis fight back against the pacifists, but instead it was the state lowers the boom on some confused but violent people. But great thing about a research project like this is in fact, the greatest thing is to be constantly surprised, whether it's the nature of his relationship with his family, whether it is the nature of his assessment of his fellow pacifists. It's a constant opening up of a treasure of a surprise. What else? Yeah.
You mentioned his involvement in KPFA. Was he there? We have a wonderful community radio station here in Colorado too, KGNU, and through that I pick up Democracy Now, where I learned of the history of KPFA's founding in Houston, and that the KKK early on tried to blow up its transmission tower twice. It blew it up. Was Roy around during that?
No, that's the first I've heard of it. And you say Houston, I'm not sure.
I'm sorry, I may be mixing up my Pacifica radio stations. I'm thinking of KPFT actually.
Okay. Yeah, no, well, Pacifica was the progenitor for a number of stations there in New York and Los Angeles and in Berkeley. And one thing that has stayed very much the same is palace intrigue is always intense. There's always, Roy got ejected eventually, or he walked out of KPFA because somebody else returned to power with whom he disagreed. I mean, these were all pacifists. These people would link arms and oppose the militarism of the state. But when it came to actually working together, they were like scorpions in a bottle. And that frequently happened with the peace groups. I mean, never get between two peace activists because they're going at it hook and claw. But I hadn't heard that particular episode now.
Just to be clear, I think it's KPFT in Houston.
Okay, but I wouldn't be surprised if it had spun off in some way from the original KPFA.
And also, you had mentioned when Roy died, the bookstore kind of started to fade.
Yes.
Can you speak again about the community?
Yeah. The question is that we were talking beforehand that, the question had to do with what happened when Roy died. Roy Kepler succumbed over a long period of time to Parkinson's disease. It weakened him. It was a very sad decline for a real dynamo of a man. A friend of his said he used to be like a little Brigham Young, who was just full of fire and zeal and energy and the word of the Lord, although he didn't believe in the Lord. But he developed Parkinson's disease and no longer able to hold up onto the store. His son, Clark Kepler, took it over, and that was in about 1980. Roy died in, I believe, January 1st, 1995. And Clark ran the store, continued to run the store. I began in January 2005, the 50th anniversary year of Kepler's. I approached Clark Kepler and said, I'd like to write your dad's biography. He said, sounds great. And in May, that there was the 50th anniversary party. Things were going great guns. I was full head of steam on my book. In October, with absolutely no warning, Kepler's closed. Nobody expected it. One day they were celebrating the 50th anniversary. The next day they were closed. They had been losing money in a tide of red ink for years. The community came together in an astonishing turnaround, raised on the order of $700,000, renegotiated the lease, restocked the bookshelves, and in October they reopened the bookstore. This was an incredible turnaround. This is a community that would not let Kepler's die. It then died again this year, or was on the verge of it, when Clark again wasn't able to make a living or make a profit. They were losing hundreds of thousands of dollars. They were deeply in debt, and he was going to have to close the store. And into the breach stepped two entrepreneurs from the Silicon Valley who had management consultants, and I'm guessing they probably did pretty well for themselves. They took over the store from Clark. He no longer has any role to play except sort of as an emeritus personage. They've refurbished it, and on Tuesday they had the grand reopening, and I did a reading there, and it was a fantastic event. It was such a happy event. This is a store that has been resurrected twice now, and all because of Roy Kepler, all because of the great love of people for Roy and what he did, and as well as this legacy love for a great bookstore. If you're gonna just think of what you feel about this bookstore here, right? You come here, you like to hang out, maybe pick up chicks here, do whatever, and it's a place. It's a home for people. That's the way Kepler's was in the Bay Area. So it lives against all odds. Any other questions?
You obviously said that you knew you were meant to write, you were the person to write this book, but what made you pick Roy Kepler?
Well, I grew up going to Kepler's.
Okay.
My parents say that they took me there when I was very young, like in the early 1960s. I have a vivid, of course I've thought about this now repeatedly, so I've probably built the memory up, but I have an extraordinarily vivid memory. It is if I am standing there as I speak to you now. I'm 12 years old, it's 1968, the Berkeley Barb Underground newspaper has articles about the San Francisco State riots. It's available at Kepler's, and I'm standing there, and I first start looking at the articles about the San Francisco State Rebellion, and then I discover there are these ads in the back of the underground newspaper. It's like, wow, parents are showing up, and put the magazine aside. And that was what Kepler's had. They would offer anything at all. So I grew up going to Kepler's from the time I was about 12. I would ride my bike there just all the time and hang out. And that was the foundation for later when I worked at a paper in Palo Alto called the Palo Alto Weekly, and I wrote story after story about people who had some affiliation with either Kepler's or the 60s scene. There's a writer named Gurney Norman, a really great Kentucky writer, and he was an affiliate. And I wrote about him for the Weekly, and there was the psychologist who turned Ken Kesey onto LSD, and is thanked for that in the foreword to, or the introduction to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was running psychodrama programs and was very closely involved with Kepler's. I wrote about him. So I just was picking away. And in the same way as when you're word about a summit, the trail makes sense looking back. I didn't know I was picking away at different facets of the Kepler story at the time. Looking back now, it all makes perfect sense. It was all of a piece. Anything else? Well, if not, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on out. The book was a labor of love. I think it's a fun read. It's has a lot of information about some pretty fascinating periods, and it's gorgeously produced by my friends at Syracuse University Press. So for those of you of a mind, I'm here to sign it for you if you're here to buy it. But thanks for your time. First of all, props to the Tattered cover. What a fantastic bookstore. I have not been here before. I've heard about it for a long time. When my publishers at Syracuse University Press said I was in California for the rollout of the book yesterday and the day before, when I was setting the trip up, they said, well, there might be space available at the Tattered cover. And I said, well, that would be fantastic. I've heard about it for a long time, but would the book sell there? And they said, well, there's no harm in trying. And so I said, well, I'm up for that. So here I am. I'd like to tell you a little bit about what this book is about. And in doing so, tell you a little bit about who Roy Kepler was. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how the book came about. This is my second book. I'm a professional journalist in the Washington Bureau of McClatchy newspapers. I've been writing stories a long time, and yet this book in particular riveted home for me like nothing else has before, some lessons about how facts come into place and how contingent a work of history is. Because I don't know about you, but when I pick up a hardcover book, a gorgeously produced book like this, it seems set in black and white as if this is the only story that could ever have been told. This is the life and times of pacifist bookseller Roy Kepler. University system. At the time, Colorado University was run by a craven individual named Robert Stearns, who capitulated to the American Legion and others who wanted to chase all the Reds out of academia. And so President Stearns hired two former FBI agents who prepared a witch list of people to be fired, dangerous characters like a square dance instructor, a philosophy instructor, an historian, and others. Roy Kepler eventually moved on past Colorado. His parents lived here for a time. So this is a hometown man of whom I write. This is the story of the civilian public service camps of World War II. Roy was one of 12,000 conscientious objectors who were accepted as having the proper reasons for opposing war. They were sent to a succession of camps throughout the country of different types. Some were high-minded, virtuous, and hardworking. Roy, for instance, worked at what was crudely called the Laurel Center for the Feeble-Minded. Conscientious objectors worked in medical experiments, they worked on farms, they worked in mental hospitals, they did exemplary work. They also went to camps that were lunatic asylums for the inmates that degenerated into sheer anarchy and chaos. In fact, one thing I discovered vividly is a life of times. This book is a contingency. It could have turned out any number of ways. Roy Kepler is the subject of the book. It is the life and times. This book uses Roy Kepler's life as a window into fascinating episodes of 20th century American history. Roy was a Colorado man, born and bred. He was born in Denver, went to North Denver High School, graduated from North Denver High School. He was drafted, or would have been drafted, except that he had declared himself a conscientious objector, as did his older brother Earl. The Denver Draft Board didn't believe that someone who didn't go to church could have religious or spiritual scruples against war. They denied his older brother's request, sent him off to prison. Earl was in prison for 9 months, later to join his brother for a fatefully short period. Roy was luckier. He was granted by his Denver Draft Board conscientious objector status and went off. After the war, he returned to Colorado, graduated from Colorado University, where in 1950 to 1952, he was a leader in the movement not only against nuclear war, but against conscription and against the Red scare that was sweeping the universe, that had no principle beyond thumbing their nose and doing nothing to satisfy the overseers of the camp. And Roy served in those camps as well. So this book is the story of the great hopes that underlay the civilian public service ideal and how it collapsed into impotence and rage. This book is the story of listener-sponsored public radio. After Roy graduated from Colorado, he went to California and with fellow civilian public service veterans, fellow pacifists, he started the first listener-sponsored radio station in the United States, KPFA, the foundation of what's now Pacifica Radio. The idea was revolutionary that these pacifists had. Radio is not to be schmaltzy, it's not to be layered with commercials and hype and BS. We will have, they said to themselves, radio that speaks directly, intelligently, entertainingly, but rationally about the issues of the day. We'll have music, we'll have full board discussion of what really matters. We'll talk to people as adults, not as people to be targeted for the purchase of commodities. And Roy was at the center of that until palace intrigue did him in. This is the story of the paperback revolution. Roy Kepler began his bookstore in Menlo Park, California in 1955. 1 year earlier, the poet and Navy veteran Lawrence Ferlinghetti began City Lights, the famous City Lights bookstore in San Francisco. 1 year after Kepler's began, Pat and Fred Cody began Cody's bookstore in Berkeley. Cody's, City Lights, and Kepler's were the triumvirate in the San Francisco Bay Area, the three most remarkable independent bookstores on the West Coast, and to some degree the spiritual forefathers of the great stores like the Tattered page here. This is the story of the anti-war movement in the 1960s. Roy was an early opponent of the Vietnam War before it was even known as the Vietnam War. At the time that the Green Beret advisors were first going into South Vietnam, Roy was already trying to rally opposition to it. He was instigator of some of the most important rallies, in particular in 1967 at the Oakland Draft Center. He was a spiritual and organizational leader, and through his experiences, this book opens a window into the anti-draft movements of the 1960s. This book is the story of the Silicon Valley. The people who began the personal computer revolution got their start at Kepler's also. Steve Wozniak, the co-founder of Apple Computer,